So accumulate, said Moses to the prophets. And accumulate we have done plenty of. We've had lots of accumulation. We continue to have accumulation. The question tonight is the implications, historically and currently, of this long-standing process of accumulation. My own work focuses on the globalization of production and the creation and distribution of value in the production process globally. And what we observe through myriad case studies is plenty of industrial upgrading, as the literature calls it, but on a much more limited scale, social upgrading, much more limited instances of employment, wage, labor standards, environmental standards, gains, despite this so-called successes of industrial upgrading. So we see pockets of growth and we see a global economic crisis. Tonight we have, as Ashok said, and thank you very much, Lopa, for both inviting me and mostly for putting this remarkable panel together. We have a very distinguished panel to discuss these issues of economic development, both in broad historical perspective and I hope, of course, in terms of the current crisis. They will focus on India and China, and I look forward very much not only to their presentations, but to your engagement with them. We have three very distinguished panelists. I will introduce them briefly and then turn it over to them. Partha Chatterjee is Professor of Political Science at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University, scholar of post-colonial studies, a founding member of the Subaltern Studies group of historians, which attempts to analyze the history of a nation from the perspective and voices of those outside the centers of power and utilize the radically different ways of seeing history that they have represented. His works include nationalist thought in the colonial world, The Nation, Its Fragments, A Princely Imposter, The Strange and Universal History of the Kumar of Bawal, The Politics of the Governed, and Subaltern Studies, series of works. David Harvey, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His work has contributed greatly to broad social and political debate. Most recently, he has been credited with helping to bring back social class Marxist methods as serious methodological tools in the critique of global capitalism, particularly its neoliberal variant. His concept of accumulation through dispossession is particularly relevant for tonight's panel. Among his many books are The Limits to Capital, The New Imperialism, Spaces of Global Capitalism, and Cosmopolitanism and the Geographies of Freedom. And I'm very pleased, of course, to welcome them from Columbia and CUNY, and I was going to say most of all, but equally, my colleague Duncan Foley, the Leo Modell Professor of Economics at the New School, who needs very little introduction here. His works, especially from the perspective of long-period understanding of classical economics, are particularly relevant for putting into both theoretical and historical perspective some of the issues that we will get to, and Duncan will be our third speaker on the panel. His works include the very important Understanding Capital, Marx's Economic Theory, and most recently Adam's Fallacy, A Guide to Economic Theology. So I will stop there and turn right to our panelists, and we will begin with Professor Harvey and then Professor Chatterjee, and batting cleanup will be Professor Foley.
Thanks for calling me distinguished. It's the first time an economist has ever called me distinguished. I usually use other adjectives to describe what I do, but that's anyway, thank you very much. Earlier this year I was invited to write a short book to try and explain crisis against the background of dynamics of crisis formation, theories of crisis formation under capitalism. And I finished it a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I'd relay to you some of the ideas that came out of it. It was a very interesting exercise. In the process I found myself having to rewrite almost everything I thought I knew about Marxian crisis theory, and in particular rewrite it against the background of Grundrisse rather than writing it against the background of capital. And I also found myself rewriting much of what I think Marx's theory of development, capitalist development, is. Now, I'm obviously not going to be in a position to talk about all of that tonight, so I thought I'd just go over some basic ideas about development and put it against the background of what seems to me a looming problem within capitalism over the last 30 or 40 years, and one which is going to become much greater, much stronger as time goes on. The problem arises that actually, if you look at something like Angus Madison's history of capital accumulation, that capitalism as a system has been growing at a compound rate of growth on average throughout all this time of about 2.25% per year. What's generally considered a reasonable rate of growth is 3%. Much higher than that, it's great, much less than that, it's considered problematic. But 3% compound growth has, I think, a very interesting feature to it, as all of you will recognize, that you suddenly find yourself going from a relatively small economy to one that is, doubling every 20, 30 years. And this means that you've got to find new outlets for capital investment, larger and larger outlets, larger and larger places in which you can gain profit. Put quite simply, the total global capitalist economy right now is around $55 trillion. By 2030 it will be $100 trillion, which means that you've got to find $3 trillion worth of new investment to keep the 3% compound rate of growth going. And that is a pretty tall order. Or put another way around, just think of it physically. When capitalism was constituted by everything that was going on in, say, Manchester, Birmingham, and a few other hotspots in the global economy in, say, 1750 or 1780, and you looked at 3% compound rate of growth, you would say no problem. But you're now looking at 3% compound rate of growth on what's going on in East Asia, China, Southeast Asia, much of South Asia, and of course Europe and North America, and much of Latin America. You're beginning to look at something which starts to look less and less feasible. And part of the argument I made about the roots of the problems we've had over the last 30 years is the difficulties of finding outlets for surplus capital and getting that 3% has produced all kinds of aberrations in the way in which a capitalist economy works. To begin with, a lot of the investment goes into asset values rather than into a real production. A lot of it starts to go into immaterial goods, which doesn't mean like harm negri that you're dealing with immaterial labor. You're not. You're dealing with material labor, but nevertheless, it's the production of spectacle and production of moments as opposed to. I mean, if the 3% was actually making solid things, we would have to have huge houses to store the stuff. So you can see some of the dilemmas which are emerging, and so you start to get the leveraging on leveraging and the asset bubbles and all the rest of it which have been going on. So there's been an increasing difficulty in finding outlets for capital accumulation. And it's against that background that I want to argue that we may be at an inflection point in the history of capitalism in which we really are going to have to think about an alternative, not for moral or political reasons, such as, too much inequality or too much environmental degradation, or you just don't like the social relations and all those sorts of things. Those reasons are still there, but it's now a rather more compelling reason that it really hasn't got anywhere to go. And under those circumstances, when you start to look at the environmental constraints, the market constraints, and all the rest of it, then you've got the question of, are there going to be movements towards the construction of a non-capitalist kind of economy, and if so, how is that movement going to be set in motion, and by what dynamics is it possible to move from where we are right now, which is kind of ultra neoliberal kind of capitalism, to something which is anti-capitalist and which is, if you like, socialist or even communist. How can we actually think about that? In thinking about this, I went back and I started to look much more closely at exactly how Marx talks about the way in which feudalism gave way to capitalism. And in doing this, I was always been very impressed by a footnote in the chapter on machinery, where Marx talks about his relationship to Darwin and the evolutionary process, and then talks about the way in which technology discloses relations to nature, the means by which we produce and reproduce daily life, the social relations and the mental conceptions. And then I started to elaborate a little bit of that and looked at it and said, well, suppose we looked at, if you like, a co-evolutionary theory by which capitalism emerged from feudalism. And this co-evolutionary theory would look something like this. Let's suppose we considered there were a number of different moments which are key in this, and that they are co-moments in an evolutionary process. The first moment is technology. What are the technologies which are available to us? And how are those technologies going to change over time? This, of course, is one of the great themes in Capital. Where and how did capitalism come to arrive at its own distinctive technological forms, particularly the factory system and the machine, the production of machines by machines and all the rest of it? How did that occur? So the technological form becomes crucial. But then there is a whole kind of question of relation to nature. So this is, if you like, the second moment. How does that dynamic work? And are there blockages and difficulties in the relation to nature that need to be approached? And obviously the technological mix is not irrelevant when it comes to understanding the relation to nature and the dynamics, if you like, the dialectics of the social transformations that are occurring and the way in which the relation to nature is being reconfigured and reorganized and reorchestrated. So that is, if you like, the second moment. The third moment is the actual act of production itself. How is production organized? And in particular, by what technologies is it organized, and actually how is the transformation, how is the labor process configured, so that you can transform natural elements, material elements, into things which are of utility to us, and that we can utilize. So how is production actually configured, and by what labor process, and the like. And then the fourth element are the social relations that are involved here. What are the nature of the social relations? The social relations obviously emergent between capital and labour, but also social relations between labourers as they take on different roles within the labour process and within the market and all the rest of it. So that, if you like, is the fourth element in the process. The fifth element is the reproduction of daily life, and this is not associated too much. There's some of this in Capital, but it's sort of, but it's really about the reproduction of the species by, just simply the way in which we live and reproduce, and what daily life is about, and how daily life is necessarily transformed away from its feudal character to its more capitalistic character. So that is, if you like, the fifth element. The sixth element is what Marx called mental conceptions of the world. And this is, I think, an extremely interesting thing, because what you find him doing is saying, production used to be called an art, and then it became called a science. It's much later, because there arose a completely different set of mental conceptions to how to approach the world. Nature started to be seen as something which could be transformed, was dead matter, wasn't alive, was not animated, and all the rest of it was, if you like, what Karen Merchant calls the death of nature, as something that is alive and if you like, full of meaning and spirit and all this kind of thing. It becomes necessary to really transform the way in which we understand the world, and that, of course, is what very much associated again with the science and the technology. And then there are the institutional and administrative arrangements, the legal system, the structures of government and all the rest of it. And so what you see Marx saying is that when you look at the evolution, the transformation of feudalism into capitalism, you would not take any one of these moments and say it was determinate. You would say all of them have to move. They all have to move in dialectical relation to each other. That is, you cannot have, you cannot create capitalism simply by technological changes. You can't change it, get there either by simply changing the social relations. You have to move across. So that actually a movement is a movement across all of these moments in the developmental process, and that they all have to sort of cohere in some way. And if you look at the chapter on machinery, it's really very interesting at what point Marx invokes a moment in which it suddenly becomes important to educate the labourer. Why it is that education of children of labour and giving rudimentary possibilities of literacy and so on becomes important in this dynamic. Why does it become important? If you don't do it, then the system blocks. So the dynamic has to actually flow across all of these different moments in this developmental process. Now, when you look at that, and if you reconstruct that history in that way, then you would say to yourself, all right, what Marx also said was, this developmental process doesn't start from nowhere. It starts from where you're at a particular historical moment. You start with the technologies of late feudalism, and you then transform them. You start with the mentalities of late feudalism, and then you transform them. So you start with all of those kinds of things, and then, but it's a co-evolutionary process. Now, I'm interested in revolution. And I'm interested in revolutionary transformations. And I'm saying to myself, well, if there's going to have to be a revolutionary transformation away from capitalism, then it's going to have to, if you like, replicate the way in which this transformation occurred out of feudalism. And actually, what is interesting when you start to look at the whole history of capitalism, you'll see that capitalism has been perpetually dynamic in all of those dimensions. If we were sitting in this room in 1970, what kind of mental conceptions would we be throwing around? We wouldn't be talking all this neoliberal garbage we talk these days as if somehow or other it's natural. We would be talking much more about social solidarities. We'd be talking about a strong trade union movement. We'd be talking about a different institutional setting. We wouldn't know what an iPod was. We wouldn't know all those things which are now, we wouldn't know, oh, it's gone. All this sort of PowerPoint stuff, we wouldn't be in a world where power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. We wouldn't be, so it wouldn't be in this, I mean, actually, and then you think of the revolutionary figures. Margaret Thatcher proclaimed she was a revolutionary figure, and she was. And she said, look, my interest is in changing the soul, changing the way in which people think and understand the world. And she's been pretty successful. In many ways, we are all neoliberal now without noticing it. And I think that becomes, as it were, the dynamic. So the dynamics have occurred within capitalism in this way. And that each phase of capitalism is often a revolutionary transformation of all of those elements into a new configuration. Such that 1970 we get the neoliberal counter-revolution, if you want to call it that, which transforms all of these elements into something else. But we're now at a crisis moment. And I don't think it's going to go away, even though there are supposedly green shoots all around the place, and Bernanke assures us that everything is on its way back. But remember, Bernanke said in 2004 that systemic risks in this economy have almost entirely disappeared. So we hope his judgment these days is better than it was back then. So we're at one of these moments where there's this inflection, and we then have to think about the theory of revolutionary transformation. And I'd like to argue that actually past attempts to create communism have rather failed, it seems to me, to keep the idea of a movement between all of those moments in motion. The one peculiar exception, which many people would not, I think, like to think of in this, is in fact China. China has been very dynamic, and there are many things that happened in the Mao period which laid the basis for what happened later, which is not necessarily a good thing in the sense of socialism or communism. But the huge increase in life expectancy and the drop of infant mortality during the Mao period is something which is absolutely undeniable. And absolutely crucial, of course, to the vast labour reserves which now form the basis of Chinese economic development. Similarly, the vast transition that occurred in literacy in the Mao period laid the basis. And the breaking of the back of certain kind of feudal, pre-capitalist notions in the Mao period was also crucial. So even though there are many aspects of the Mao period that we may not want to like, and there's a general tendency to sort of dump on Mao right now, I think that actually many of the things that happened in that period were, as it were, movements in one or other of these areas that didn't complete. But so what I want to then suggest is that if we want to think about a process of revolutionary transformation, it's going to have to be a revolutionary transformation along all of those dimensions that I've mentioned. Now this in itself immediately says that actually when you ask the question, not only what is to be done, but who the hell is going to do it where, if you ask that question, then immediately, if it is crucial that we start to think about new technologies and new technological forms which are going to be characteristic of a socialist or a communist society, then what we have to do is to, as it were, find ourselves in alliance with many people in the sciences and many people who are in the business of innovation and thinking. In other words, we can't actually sort of just say, well, I'm an unemployed labourer and I'm the only one who really counts in this revolutionary process. You have to start to think about broad alliances that can have the capacity of moving. And within that, of course, then arises the question, well, if we're interested in a revolutionary movement, where do we start? Do we start with mental conceptions, as us academics do? Well, yes, we can start there. The only problem is if we stay there. You've got to move from there to the social relations, or the technologies, or the production process, or daily life. There's a whole theory out there that now kind of says revolutions are going to occur out of daily life. You know, Paul Hawken and all these other things. The autonomistas will say the revolution is going to arise out of the labour process. Well, yes, it can start there, but if it stays there, it's not going to go anywhere. So it's, as it were, a dialectical notion of revolutionary transformation, and getting away from a kind of a single bullet. Oh, it's the productive forces that matter. Oh, it's the social relations that matter. Oh, it's daily life that matters. Or more recently, Jared Diamond and all the rest of it says it's the relation to nature that matters. Or some ecologists would say that. So we have to think that all of these things matter, and think of, as it were, a conception of a social transformation that can answer that question. How on earth do we actually divorce development from growth? That seems to be the crucial question. It is absolutely absurd to say that you cannot actually change our relation to nature without growth. You cannot change social relations without growth. Capitalists always say you need growth to do all those things. We've got to learn to do all of those things without growth. At some point down the line, we have to think about a zero growth economy, but also an economy which is extremely dynamic in terms of its capacity to release human capacities and powers. Its capacity for development of human abilities, its capacity for development of human innovative possibilities. This, it seems to me, is the sort of way in which we have to start to think about the transitions that are open to us in this particular moment. And of course, these are the kinds of things that really nobody wants to talk about. And I think it's time we did. Thanks.
David has given us the broad global conditions and historical conditions, say, under which accumulation and growth is now taking place all over the world. And I'll pick up the story from there, especially underlining one of the phrases that David Harvey has made very popular. He didn't mention it this evening. Accumulation through dispossession, which appears to be a very, very important aspect of the way in which accumulation has been taking place certainly in the last 2 or 3 decades in the global context, especially if one looks at the way in which, and this David did talk about, the change in the nature of the capitalist economies in the Western world, from primarily industrial manufacturing economies into economies that largely rely on finance and the service sector and very much speculative profits. And the industrial manufacturing shifted to the so-called developing countries of the world. Now, let me especially talk about the way in which the consequences of this transformation globally is actually managed politically. In other words, the question I would like to raise is how is growth under these conditions politically managed? And this, I think, is a particularly important aspect in trying to think of the way in which the economies and polities of countries like China, India, Brazil, many of these so-called emerging or developing countries, how things will work out in these countries in the political domain, I think will have a great deal to do with the way in which the capitalist process of accumulation will develop in the next 2 or 3 decades. Now, the main thing that one needs to think about here is that whether in China or in India or in many of the other countries, the result of this new regime of accumulation globally, the fact that these countries have in fact grown very rapidly in the last decade or so, China spectacularly, India, China in the region of 10% for several years now, India in the region of 7-8%. Last year it fell to about 6%, but even under conditions of the global financial crisis. And the general consensus among those who measure these things is that although the result may have been a certain reduction in absolute poverty levels, that inequalities have grown enormously, I think nobody doubts. There have been lots of debates over this in terms of how to measure inequality, how to measure poverty and so on, but I think the general consensus is that this phase of rapid growth has been accompanied by distinct increase in inequality. This inequality is not simply a matter of incomes or disposable incomes, levels of consumption and so on, but actual dispossession of people from their traditional occupations and livelihoods, the loss of their means of labor, and the fact that these people who were thrown out of their traditional means of livelihood have not found a place in the new growth sector. That's the crucial dynamic here. The big contrast, I think, with the process of capitalist development in Europe, this is what David referred to, the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe. A very major difference in terms of the historical conditions under which this similar transition may be taking place in the developing world today is that unlike in Europe, first of all, the political conditions are completely different. The fact that most of these countries, even including China where there may not be an electoral democracy, but the fact that the levels of political mobilization of ordinary people and the levels of communication, the general extent to which there is a global view of how things are developing makes it very, very difficult for ruling groups, ruling classes to follow the same kind of political tactics that they may have done in the 18th century in England. Similarly, conditions of absorption of the labor that's thrown out of traditional agriculture and traditional crafts, and the fact that these were the people who were then absorbed into the new growing industrial sectors during the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The conditions of industrialization today are so different that there is absolutely no possibility of all of these people being absorbed in the new growth sectors of the economy. And of course, the conditions of emigration which existed from Europe to the Americas in particular in the 18th, 19th centuries, to Australia, many of those kinds of places which were colonized, similar conditions do not exist. So what I'm suggesting is that the political conditions under which rapid growth, rapid industrial growth has to take place are radically different. What are the possibilities here? And that's basically what I'll talk about as briefly as I can. I think one of the things that one has seen, and this has been observed in many reports, is the informalization of labor. A process that has been going on very rapidly in many of these countries. I'll just simply confine myself to the Indian situation, about which I know more than in the other countries. Informalization of labor. The fact that the people who are thrown out of traditional agriculture or the traditional crafts do not find employment in the formal sectors of industry. They very often crowd into the cities. The story of the third world cities is very well known, the enormous explosion of population in these cities. The very large bulk of these people who move into the cities move into what we call the informal sector. People who set up, find some means of livelihood somewhere, often in manufacturing, but manufacturing not under corporate capital, in the huge service sectors, and the self-employed sectors. There is a similar informalization going on in the rural areas too, in terms of the very rapid growth of non-agricultural activities in the rural areas. It's one of the things that's very, very striking in the Indian situation in the last 15 or 20 years, is the fact that there is a definite decline in the proportion of laborers employed in agriculture. But these are not necessarily people who move out entirely of the rural areas. But there is a rise in non-agricultural occupations of all kinds, ranging from transport to food processing to all kinds of other small sector, informal sector activities in rural areas. Now, how are these people governed? That's the interesting question. I would argue that, in fact, there is first of all a political need to govern these people so that their livelihood needs are to some extent protected. This is a political need. There is no particular economic logic in terms of the logic of capital itself. The growth sectors of the urban economies could well proceed if, for instance, by some miracle, political miracle, these zones were to be politically completely isolated and secluded from the rest of the country. But of course, that political miracle, despite the fact that I suppose many leading capitalists might want it that way, it's not going to happen. The result is that it is through a certain process of political negotiation in which the state plays the mediating role. A certain amount of resources are understood that these resources would have to be transferred from the growth sectors through various processes, including taxation, in order to provide for the basic livelihood needs of these people who have been thrown out of traditional sectors of employment, livelihood. These take place through all kinds of special poverty removal programs to various, in the Indian case, for instance, in the last few years, there's a very major program of the guaranteed employment scheme for 100 days in the year for anybody who wants it. There are special schemes for building houses, for taking care of children, and so on and so forth, especially for people below the poverty sector and for people who are marked by social disprivilege, such as, for instance, on grounds of caste, which is a very important political and social factor in the Indian situation. Now, these are, of course, the in terms of what in the Indian context is called social sector expenditure. These are provided for in the budget of the government. But apart from that, and this is the point that I would particularly like to emphasize, I believe there is a whole sector of the management of non-corporate capital of this kind, the informal sector, which is really the non-corporate sector, which takes place through political mechanisms, through political negotiations, which allow for these informal sector units and informal sector self-employed people very often to engage in illegalities which are not allowed to the corporate sector, to the organized sector. So, for instance, you will have a whole range of production units in the informal sector which may not conform to the environment rules, pollution rules. They may not actually pay taxes. They may not even own the land on which they are based. They very often are squatters who occupy usually public land, government land, and set up not only habitation, residences, that is to say, all of the slum and shantytown settlements that are so common in the third world cities, but also production centers of a very wide variety. Now, the interesting feature is that on the one side, there is, of course, an entire structure of property and law, which has to be maintained by the state. Alongside, there is this huge informal sector, which very often is on the borderline of law, very often on the other side of the law. The state agencies do not necessarily use the powers of the state simply to throw out or eradicate or erase these informal units which violate the law. On the contrary, they actually negotiate and work out various arrangements through which they are, as it were, governed, while acknowledging that these units could only survive if they violated the law. Now, this, I think, is a very interesting feature, and it is almost, one might say, the bread and butter of grassroots democratic politics or electoral politics in the Indian scene. That a very large part of what is negotiated in the electoral space is precisely the claims of various groups of this kind to, as it were, be declared as exceptions to the rule. I'm suggesting this as a very important technique of the political management of growth. That, in fact, whereas on the one side, the state must protect property, protect the zones of corporate capital and the logic of accumulation and profit making in those sectors. But alongside, the political condition of guaranteeing the conditions of continued accumulation is that this other enormous sector of labor, which is not directly absorbed into the growth sectors, must be politically managed so that they continue to, as it were, reproduce their means of subsistence, but under conditions which do not necessarily agree with the legal structures of property and taxation and, for instance, environmental rules, etc., etc. These are all, of course, negotiations that can only take place and can hold in local situations. They are contextual, they are not permanent arrangements, So for instance, you will find in one particular area, you will have squatters or, peddlers on the street, or small-scale manufacturing of some kind on public land, occupied land, which go on for 20, 30 years, and suddenly the local political situation could change, and you will find the state or the forces of the law suddenly coming down on these people and throwing them out of that area. These entitlements are not equal to claims of legal property. But the state also does not deal with these people as proper citizens in living in civil society. These are populations who live, whose claims are always, as it were, under a certain political process of political negotiation. Now, my argument would be that a very large reason why the broad sectors of the urban economy and also the rural agrarian economy, for the most part, that they are politically managed, even under these conditions of rapid growth causing clear dispossession. The fact that it has been managed and is being managed is because of precisely this process of political negotiation in what I have called this zone political society, where these entitlements are negotiated through the political mechanisms. It doesn't mean that all of these zones of marginalization are necessarily always successfully integrated or included within these areas. There are always significant sections of marginalized populations who do not have place do not find a place within this zone of political society. They find it for all sorts of reasons. They have found it difficult, sometimes impossible, to make their claims through the electoral system. So for instance, in particular, I would suggest in the Indian case, there are very major sections of the population who are called tribal in the Indian case, particularly the central Indian states. Many of these people are not regular agriculturalists. They are very often, they are so marginalized, they very often depend on forest products and are only marginal to the main agrarian economy. Well, these people in recent times, many of you may have, there was a story, was it yesterday in the New York Times about this insurgency in central India in so many regions, led by Maoist groups. These are people who clearly have not found a place in political society. These continue to be marginalized population that actually have to be put down by force. But to the extent that the larger part of the economy, and here one might well argue that the space of the economy which is directly under what one might call corporate capital is probably no larger than, if you think of this as encompassing sections of the population, it's probably no larger than 15 or 20% of the population who are largely in urban, industrial and service sector occupations, white collar, middle class, whichever way you describe these people, or the organized working class. There is a huge part, I would say a majority, of the working people in India are not in this sector. They are in what I would call the non-corporate, that is to say informal and self-employed sector, including the very large part of small owning peasants who still comprise the largest part of agricultural producers in India. But these are all very largely people who, despite the process of marginalization, are, I would say, more or less within a zone which the ruling groups feel can be politically managed. And what I'm suggesting is this is the mechanism by which they are managed. As I said, that there is still a further zone, a further section of marginalized people who fall outside this, and it is now widely acknowledged that this is a section which the state and the ruling groups have failed to bring within the zone of political management. Now, I'm sure the techniques of political management in a country like China will be very different, largely because the political mechanisms are so different. But my hunch is, although I cannot claim to have any special knowledge of China, my hunch is that there are similar, if not similar technically, but broadly speaking, similar processes of political management of populations in China, which have also to take place through processes of political negotiations of different kinds. One knows, of course, of agitations, of unrest, of which have been sometimes put down by force in the Chinese case. But broadly speaking, given the possibility that in China too there has been to some extent dispossession, to a much larger extent the rise of inequalities, what is the political management of this process of accumulation? My final point, therefore, would be that if one is asking for a development without or beyond accumulation, I have no vision to offer, except to say that in the Indian situation, certainly one can see that there is an acknowledgement that there is a sector of production which is not directly guided by the logic of accumulation, where, for instance, and in this entire sector of what I'm calling the non-corporate or informal sector, the principal logic is the survival of the people who work in these areas, the survival of the units, the meeting of livelihood needs. That's basically the logic of this sector. It is acknowledged that it is politically necessary to meet the requirements of this sector, even at the expense of rates of growth, of rapid rates of growth. That in fact, rates of growth may have to be kept, may have to be sacrificed to a certain extent in order to keep this other sector of people within the zones of a politically managed state. So, if that is a logic beyond accumulation, well, maybe that is something that might be developed. What I see is that these two sectors are, as it were, hand in hand. They work in tandem, and that the logic of accumulation and growth cannot do without the coexistence of this other sector of informal and non-corporate production. So let me stop there.
I tempted to echo David Harvey and also Richard Nixon by saying we are all revolutionaries now, in one way or another. And by that, I mean a couple of things that I'd just like to develop as kind of background to a discussion of what I would call the growth paradigm and where the growth paradigm is going at this point. First of all, my view about change is, I guess, very dialectical. I think change is happening all the time, and it's happening at many, many different levels all the time. So sometimes it focuses on dramatic military or social events that we call revolutions, but a lot more change also is happening out of the things that David Harvey called day-to-day life. And the example of the emergence of capitalist society from feudal society is extremely interesting in that respect, but also points up some problems for having a similar change in mode of production from capitalist society. One of the great advantages that capitalism had is that it was possible for people to have little pieces of capitalism in what you might call the interstices of feudal society. So if individual cities or towns got freedoms or got themselves in some way exempted from the general feudal social structures and structures of power, it was possible for proto-capitalist relations of production and exchange and the commodity to grow in those interstices. And if one part of it was for some reason cut off or suppressed, it was very much like those kind of worms that when you cut them in half, they grow into two new ones. So the piece of capitalism that was left might turn up 40 or 50 years later even that much more vigorous. So I think we want to think about social change at the level that David Harvey is talking about. I think it's extremely important to do that. And I think that he's also right to point to the fact that that involves a whole hierarchy of levels of change. Let me give a specific example of that about the current financial crisis in the United States. It's not going to be the case that Ben Bernanke or Barack Obama or Larry Summers is going to go on television and tell you, well, it looks like the neoliberal financialization model of capitalism is over with. And so we're going to replace that, and here's what we're going to do, okay? We're going to have a new system. To some degree, Margaret Thatcher, I guess, did do that. I mean, she did propose a kind of comprehensive vision of a future, which I think was probably on the wrong track, but she did. But I don't think that's how it's going to happen. How it's going to happen is that they are going to say to themselves, we have this problem, X, and this problem, Y, and this problem, Z, and we are going to deal with those problems in separate ways. Find some way to cope with financial instability. Find some way to cope with the aggregate demand problem at the level of the global economy. Find some way to cope with the instability of exchange rates and so forth. Now, how the collection of decisions that they make about those things will, in fact, when we look back 20 years later, have created, to a very considerable degree, a new model of capitalism, and maybe even some pieces of a new model of world productive organization. But it won't happen. There won't be a moment when we just vote on that or we decide it all at once. It's going to come in this piecemeal, cumulative fashion. With that sort of general background, let me go say some more, some broader things. I agree with David Harvey that we're at a point, maybe more than ever before, or more than ever in my lifetime at least, where we do have to do some fundamental rethinking. And fundamental rethinking is something that human beings are really bad at. I think we have to realize that we always bring to any problem that we face the hope that it is the same problem that we solved last week or last year, and that the same techniques and methods will work. I was always amused when I was advising undergraduate students at Barnard College that many of the students were in violent revolt against their parents' values and their parents' way of dealing with problems. But when they themselves faced a big problem in their life, it turned out that the resources that they fell back on were almost always their parents' way of dealing with things. And this same problem is going to happen as we try to confront the future of the global economy. But let me try to give us some language to talk about this. And I tend to think of this in terms of what I call the growth paradigm, which is a little bit broader than capital accumulation, because I would say even a good deal of Marxist thinking partakes of the growth paradigm. But in its most extreme form, the growth paradigm would be something like what Robert Lucas would, the way Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago Economics Department sees the world. So in their model, there is a traditional society which is just hopeless. You know, it's just hopeless. You can't get anything done. People aren't productive. They won't change. So into this world of a traditional society, a sort of entropic concept of traditional society in some ways, comes capitalism, okay? And capitalism is the bourgeois revolution and its bourgeois values, and it gets stuff done. It's effective. It changes people. It changes people's values the way Margaret Thatcher did, and it galvanizes people, and it gets people solving problems. So what's going to happen is, from this Robert Lucas point of view, which I don't happen to share, is that the only way that these basic problems of meeting human needs and stabilizing conditions of existence for human beings is going to take place by the gradual spread of these capitalist institutions over the whole world and to the whole world population. Now, if you confront people who think that way, which is most economists, I would say, with the unevenness that, for example, Professor Chatterjee was talking about and that we're all aware of, they said, well, what do you expect? People are going to catch up, and there's going to be omelets. I mean, there's going to be eggs broken to make the capitalist omelet. So you're going to have these problems of social unrest and dispossession and so forth to manage along the way. But ultimately, the only thing to do is stick with it until everybody is part of the bourgeois system, and then these problems will be in a position to be solved. And in some ways, actually, this is not so far away from certain versions of Marxism, even that you can find in Marx himself, who saw in the Communist Manifesto the historical mission of capitalism to develop what he called the productive forces to the point where a socialist and therefore truly human life would be possible. And it's not so different from, for example, a Menshevik view in Russia, which said, well, if you really want to get socialism in Russia, the first thing you got to do is get effective capitalism in Russia. It turned out that nobody's ever figured out how to get effective capitalism in Russia, either before or after the Russian Revolution, but that is a somewhat secondary point. I think David Harvey's right. I don't believe in this, in certainly that version of the growth paradigm. An alternative version of the growth paradigm would be the sort of developmentalist paradigm, which says, okay, well, something like that is true, but it's just that capitalist social relations are a good way to do it. So what we really want to do is we want to have growth without capitalism. We want to have growth either under the sponsorship of the state or through some other form of accumulation. And that was really the developmentalist paradigm of the 1950s and 1960s and maybe up to the 1970s, I think, which was that you could substitute the state for capitalists as an agent of economic growth. Well, I think David is right that growth paradigm is over, and I think largely for the reasons that he listed. I think we're hitting environmental constraints, we're hitting population constraints that just will not allow us to imagine that we can grow our way out of the social problems and the social contradictions that the world economy faces. Now, that doesn't mean that tomorrow Barack Obama is going to get up and say, well, folks, growth is finished, okay? So if on a world scale, so if the Chinese are going to really grow at 8% per year, the U.S. economy is going to have to shrink at 2% per year for the next, that's going to be our economic policy goal. I don't think that's, it's not going to happen that way either. But I think we are going to have to confront over and over again the fact that the notion that we can grow our way out of these problems is going to be increasingly bankrupt as a way of thinking about world social problems. Let me just conclude with one more remark about economics and economic growth theory. And this has to do with some pitfalls along the line of trying to think of, in David Harvey's words, of development without growth. We're trying to divide in our minds the notion of economic and social development from growth. In a way, the growth paradigm could be summed up as the fallacy that those two things are inexorably connected, right? That the only way to develop it is through growth. And so in a lot of ways, I think his remarks lead in exactly the right questions. There's going to, however, be a version of economic growth theory which I think we have to be wary of because, and the way to this has been paved, for example, by the emergence of what's called an endogenous growth theory, which focuses growth not so much on the actual material increase in output, but on technological change in particular. And in these types of models, there's a tendency to represent worlds in which some of the aspects of capital accumulation and growth, namely technological progress and increase in labor productivity and ratios of that kind, can continue to increase even if the system as a whole becomes stationary or settles to some kind of a steady state in terms of population and total material use. This way of thinking of a possible future is facilitated by the use of certain mathematical devices like Cobb-Douglas production functions, which have the curious implication that you can get output or welfare or whatever you want to think of as GDP or production. You can meet human needs without any particular input. Herman Daly satirizes this very nicely by saying, well, it's as if you could bake a cake with less and less flour as long as the chef moved faster and faster around the kitchen and whipped the smaller and smaller amount of flour more and more rapidly. Well, clearly we can't, that's not the way human life works. We do have some unavoidable material needs, and we're going to have to interact in some unavoidable ways with the material environment. So that particular view that development without growth could be just like economic growth models, but where only productivity and therefore welfare increase is I think not enough of a critical way to think of it. Just to mention a kind of a striking thing along these lines. I was doing some modeling about world economic growth and world economic growth and global warming, and started to look at what economic growth models were projecting, standard economic growth models for the world economy. And you find that they project things like that world average income per capita income might be like $60,000 in 2030 or 2050. And that didn't seem quite right to us, so we toned everything down to get it to stabilize out around $20,000. And I took this to a group of people who are concerned, mostly agronomists, who are concerned about things like soil quality and the environment. And I put this slide up on the PowerPoint, and they started laughing and rolling on the floor. And I said, what's so funny about that? It goes to a steady state. They said, there's no way that human beings can have $20,000 per capita income. That is just fantasy. And if you and the other economists think that you're talking about the real world, forget it. You know. So we're in an area where there's a big divergence in understandings of possible futures, even at these most basic levels.
So why don't we immediately open up the microphones, or maybe just stand up, we're not such a big room.
When you think about revolutionary change, how do we think about state power? In the sense that you mentioned legal or juridical arrangements and so on, but beyond that, that to even move forward on our relation to nature or changing our mental capacities, isn't the state going to intervene if they sense there is going to be, in order to keep the bourgeois regime?
Why don't we collect a few comments? You had your hand up before, go ahead.
To the panel, it certainly was very stimulating. Quick question to Professor Harvey. You mentioned the a call to arms, as it were, to the multifactorial change. My slight issue with that is that could have been taken, or many of those notions have been explored by particularly totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, either on the National Socialist side or the Communist side. Given their tendency to do what it is that they do, how does one actually do that in a mass, voluntary fashion without ending with coercion or lack of liberty? And to Professor Chatterjee, you mentioned the issue of dispossession and the loss of traditional jobs. I'm going to guess or to submit to you that the biggest sector that has lost jobs would be child labor and bondage labor. Would you consider that to be, of course hypothetically, not morally, a good idea to reinstate those notions? And would you say that perhaps corruption would be the greatest problem facing India rather than the free market economy? Thank you.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a two-part question for Professor Harvey and Professor Chatterjee. Professor Harvey, you mentioned the movement of the key movements, and we have to, in order to replicate, move away from capitalism, you have to replicate that movement in its dialectical manner. But that development has a lot to do with how we see nature as natural resource, and that inevitably is linked with religion and politics of religion, especially in the case of India. So in terms of moving forward, how do you sort of see that question being addressed? And Professor Chatterjee, on the same lines, a lot of these marginalized movements in India, as you speak about it, use a lot of this religious symbolism, and that's an issue that has bothered a lot of people. So in order for this political society to move forward, how do you sort of reconcile these things?
On this question of the linkages between the corporate and the non-corporate is a very important subject which I didn't want to expand on because it could take us in a whole other direction of trying to explain the structural characteristics of what I was describing. But very quickly, it is completely true that there are actually structural links between the corporate and the non-corporate sector. Because as you know, a very large part of the informalization is in fact very often a movement from sectors of production which used to be in the organized corporate sector and have been moved up into the informal sector, right? So a very large part of the products of these informal or unorganized sectors of production are actually tied to manufacturing and marketing networks, which are in the corporate sector. right? So the connections are very strong. It is also possible for people, clearly there are units in the non-corporate sector which accumulate enough over time and then move into a kind of corporate status. But the interesting problem, the phrase you use, can we think of this as a kind of reserve army of labor? And this is where I would suggest that, in fact, that would be somewhat misleading. Because, in fact, the reserve army idea always has as a kind of perspective a notion of the full employment, everybody within the organized sector in the end, and the reserve army is reserve, right, in relation to that perspective. My hunch is that the structural notion that is now being assumed takes it for granted that there never will be this full transition of the informal sector into the formal. So that, many of the older perspectives of the reserve army of labor, or for instance, Marx and the Grundrisse talking about formal and real subsumption, those are not necessarily appropriate in terms of trying to understand what the present circumstances is. Because my hunch is that the assumption today is that growth will never, at least in the foreseeable future, will never lead to the incorporation of all of these laborers into the formal sector. They will stay in that condition of informality. Now, on the question of child labor and bonded labor, you see, part of the transition, especially in terms of the loss of employment in agriculture, it has paradoxical results. Very often, it means that households where earlier on all of the members of the family would have been employed in agriculture, increasingly find it impossible to do so. So that usually only a few members stay in agriculture, the rest move into non-agricultural occupations. Interestingly, it's in the informal sector that you actually have very often a replication and a new condition of the employment of child labor, and perhaps even conditions of bondage. Now, these are not necessarily the forms of bondage that one would have seen in pre-capitalist agriculture. It would have been different forms of bondage, very often through mechanisms of indebtedness, for instance. But even in urban informal economies, you find very large part employment of child labor, even though this is technically illegal, right? But this is part of the new negotiations, right? And very often state agencies will say, well, what do we do? Political leaders will say, what do we do with these children? Because their parents cannot afford to send them to school, even though there is provision for free education and so on. One of the interesting dilemmas politically that has emerged is a kind of trade-off between livelihood needs of families and the requirements, for instance, of children being educated, which are all priorities, right? But the political negotiation very often tends to put the priority on immediate livelihood needs rather than these other long-term investments in human capital. The final question on, for instance, all of those dark side, the dark side of political society. There is no point romanticizing this domain of negotiated politics. There is a great deal there which is not worthy of approval, including the resort to various, communitarian, ethnic, and other kinds of forms of building solidarities, where actually there are no solidarities, right? Yes, these are forms of populist politics, often with extremely harmful consequences. But that is precisely that domain of the political, right? Which does not conform to the principles of, the high normative principles of politics and civil society. This is not good bourgeois politics.
I'm very interested in what you might think about the whole kind of microcredit, microfinance, integration of those populations into capitalism that way, because that's a very important aspect of that. On the question of taking state power, of course, State is very crucial, and the state is a system, it's not a thing. And so it's a matter of colonizing various aspects of the state system which have positive elements and using them and getting rid of those which are not there. So yeah, I mean the reconfiguration of the state is crucial, and I think this shying away from even discussing whether the state should or should not have a role is kind of a bit crazy to me. I finally managed in a debate I've been having with Hart and Negri in Art Forum to get them to admit that taking state power is not a bad thing, which is a considerable accomplishment in my view to that point of the argument. So yeah, of course, the state is one moment, but again, if the state becomes the only moment that you're concerned with, then it gets some of the problems that have got raised over there about the imposition of things by some sort of state fiat and the worst it comes to how. But I sense behind your question, again, one of the things that people are dead scared of for some reason or other is talking about totalities and social organization as totalities. Because immediately people think, oh, totalities are totalitarian. And so you disempower yourself, however, if you kind of move away and say, well, you can't think about social structure that way. You've got to think of it as totally dispersed and nothing's related to anything else. And oh my God, we can't talk about a kind of a collective thing. Now, part of the issue you're raising is the political process whereby these transformations which I'm talking about can happen, and in that sense I'm a little more optimistic than maybe you are, and I think that actually political society, the sort you're talking about, there's a lot of experimentation going on there which is actually potentially a very fecund source of transformative politics. But again, one of the difficulties with this is that when it remains there's a great statement by Henri Lefebvre who kind of says, well, different things can go on in different places and they can look very radical, but you have to watch out because in very short order they can get actually reabsorbed into the dominant praxis. And I think that is really again and again one of the histories of these great innovations that are made, like participatory budgeting or all those sorts of issues, and a lot of things that are going on in Latin America right now. The Pictero movement and the factory occupations in Argentina and so on, but they get reabsorbed in the dominant praxis within about 2 or 3 years unless you watch out. So there's again one of the big questions about the theory of revolutionary change has to look into that. And actually, I disagree with Duncan a bit about this. That actually there are a lot of interstices around in capitalism. I mean, you kind of said, well, it was easier with feudalism because there were places you could be, and then, it'd be about the worm and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of go, actually, there's a lot more of that around within a capitalist world than we think. And so, work the interstices, find the innovative stuff, but then you've got to scale it up somehow into something which is a real transformation, which really creates an anti-capitalist movement. At some point or other, we have to have an anti-capitalist movement, which does say, I'm not going to wait for Barack Obama to say this. I say, this is what we have to do. This is our task. It's not, of course he's not going to go on television and say, we're going to do this. This is our task, and this is why we have to create the political movement that's going to do these things. Now, part of my argument also in terms of, you mentioned the relation to nature and again, a lot of these issues, I don't have, I have personal views about some of these things, but I don't think that necessarily, you can come and say to me, well, what's the answer to this? I think this is what a social order has to do, a social movement has to do, is to discover and answers. And it is indeed true that, for instance, as soon as you get into the idea of the relation to nature, that there's something holy about it, or there is something intrinsic about it, and that therefore should we be talking about intrinsic values as opposed to monetary values. As soon as you start talking that language, you are indeed talking in a very different way about how we should actually, say, work in relation to nature in terms of, I don't know, some notions of respect for nature, respect for different forms of life, all those sorts of questions. I have personal opinions about that, and I can kind of say, well, my personal opinion is that, and you should agree with me. No, I think those are the kinds of things that have to be discussed and debated and brought out, and yes, indeed, all of these kinds of historical, very deep views about our relation to nature, and it's kind of fascinating. More or less all of the myths about human origins are very much about a certain kind of conception of relation to nature, a certain mental conception, which is very powerful, and it's very powerful how it works out. And I don't particularly believe in Gaia and a few things like that myself, but on the other hand, these are the sorts of things that need to be worked out in the process. But again, my view here is that these things are always contested. If, for example, you take the view of nature in the history of capitalism, I mean, there are several books about this, which are really, I think, really fascinating. I mean, there is an aesthetic of nature, which paralleled, if you like, this notion of nature as a dead object. So actually, even within the history of capitalism, it's not as if there was a one monolithic view of what our relation to nature was about. It actually was always contested, continues to be contested to this day. And I'm all in favour of contestation. I mean, I think that actually one of the things we've got to get away from is the idea that the perfect society is one where no arguments are to be had, actually, and it has to be much more dialectical than that. And I remember once I was invited by the Episcopalian Bishop of Philadelphia to come to his annual meeting to talk about things, and at that time I was working on notions of spaces of hope and dialectical utopianism and all this kind of stuff, and I gave all this talk about dialectical utopianism. It was very interesting. A lot of theologians were there, and that's really very interesting. The big problem with the Christian concept of paradise is it's static and it's so goddamn boring, nobody wants to go there. So actually, why don't we have a dialectical view of paradise? And I think, yeah, well, why not? So I actually had a long conversation with them for about a year and a half, emails flying back about the dialectical conception of paradise. So I think, we have to actually think in those terms, and that again I think gets us away from this notion of somehow or other to think about a totality is in fact to take a very totalitarian position about the evolutionary process. I think the co-revolutionary process is an open process, an open dialectical process.
A question for Professor Chatterjee. I was very interested in your focus on political management as well as the informal economy. Okay, and I don't know too much about the India context aside from what I read in the newspapers, New York Times and such. But in the U.S. context, two institutions that play a dominant role in politically managing, let's say, vulnerable populations into maybe vulnerable to informal economy. Okay, number one, the prison system, but also the military. Okay, military recruitment specifically. And I was wondering in the U.S. India context, does the military play a role in, say, this issue of political management and, say, recruiting, portions of the population that would otherwise be vulnerable to, the informal labor market?
My question is for Professor Harvey. You said you're for revolution. I am too. Except I'm afraid where our viewpoints perhaps diverge is that for me the biggest difference between revolution and evolution is the place of agency. And when you started speaking about revolutionary transformation, you said that the current financial crisis and the reason why it represents perhaps an inflection moment in the history of capitalism is that we're faced with, I guess, more or less pragmatic constraints to capital. Now, and you spoke about developing future prospects in terms of anti-capitalism, but I believe that normative considerations must play a role, especially if we are to take the 7 levels of, I guess, co-evolution seriously. And it's difficult for me to imagine how we could do that without tackling the normative aspects as to where we want to go. So, if you could please address that.
I'd like to actually sort of encourage a dialogue between Professor Harvey and Professor Chatterjee in a very specific sense. Has the neoliberal stage ended? If it has ended, is what Professor Chatterjee is speaking of alluding to perhaps post-capitalist transformation? Are we looking at a way in which the Indian state now wants deliberately to engage with political society in its own sense? Or are we actually just seeing a transformation, or if you wish, adaptation of the neoliberal state further? In either sense, to me, the question that I'd like to pose to Professor Harvey directly is, are we really at a stage where we can speak of a post-capitalist politics or of an anti-capitalist manifesto? Or are we simply looking at a moment where the neoliberal state reimagines itself? And the question I'd like to pose directly to Professor Chatterjee is, where is the space, to follow from the previous question, for political agency? Are we in a grim situation where political society in India is co-opted by the state, and we are left to the Maoists and the tribal people to lead us towards an anti-capitalist politics?
Well, let me circle around this. Is neoliberalism over? It depends what you mean by neoliberalism. My view of neoliberalism was that it was always a class project to accumulate more and more power and centralize more and more power and restore power. And it used, however, the market and all of the stuff about personal responsibility and the state getting out of the way and blah, 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 as a series of mechanisms to justify what in effect has happened, which is the massive accumulation of wealth in a few hands at the top of the pyramid. It was about that all along. I think they understood extremely well Marx's point that there's nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals, and that actually what the market does is precisely engage in that practice, and that therefore if you enter into the market with unequal endowments, then you get screwed. And that's how it works, and they understood that all along. So they gave all this stuff about freedom and liberty and blah 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 as part of the way in which to make sure that they got the market system in place whereby they could accumulate power. Now, if you kind of say to me, are they giving up their power right now? Are they surrendering it? The answer is no. If the role of the state was during their period to protect financial institutions at all costs, and if there was a conflict between protecting financial institutions and protecting the people, you screwed the people and protected the financial institutions, and they're doing the same goddamn thing now as they've been doing, as they did actually in the Mexican debt crisis. Back in 1982, that's what they did to Mexico. They protected the financial institutions, not in Mexico, by the way, it's in New York investment banks, because they lent money to Mexico, and they made the Mexicans pay up, so the Mexicans had to pay to be able to, and this is the beginnings of moral hazard, as we know, and it's been going on, and it's still going on. And if the role of the state is to create a good investment climate for capital, yes, it's doing the same thing. And what's the Indian state doing? It's creating special enterprise zones and all the rest of it. I mean, so no, neoliberalism is not over. In fact, it's consolidating, if anything else, as I see it right now. And it's consolidating power. But what that then leads, I think, however, to the one thing that I think it's rather difficult to maintain right now. I think there's a legitimation crisis unfolding. In other words, you can't use the same arguments about freedom and liberty in the market and all that kind of thing. You have to you can't do it quite so easily anymore. And legitimation arguments take a little while to unfold. I mean, Wall Street crashed back in 1929, didn't produce the real big social movements until 1932-33. And I think that everybody in government and elsewhere is aware of that and is desperate to try to get out of the mess if they possibly can, to some degree or other, so that they prevent, as it were, the legitimation argument really beginning to grab hold. Social movements beginning to sort of bubble up as they can and do suddenly. And so I think there is a moment here where we have to do something of this kind. Now, behind this there lies, there is at this particular moment in time, there's a real problem. On the one hand, if you ask the question, what is to be done? It's very hard to come up with a vision of that without having an idea of who is going to do it where. In other words, if you're in Mumbai, you might think about it differently than if you're in Finland, and certainly that's different than if you were in Michigan, or or you're in Chiapas, or you're part of the Bolivarian Revolution in Latin America. In other words, what it seems to me is that the people are not prepared to talk about the vision, which would almost invariably contain strong normative elements in it. You can't, it's very hard to talk about the vision without also envisaging the people, the agents who are actually going to engage with this. But there's not a coherent political movement out there that is creating the vision. And the reason there's not a political movement coherent out there is because there is no vision. So you're locked into a kind of a circle, and we've got to break that somehow and start to move it into a spiral. That is, movements start to come into being, and we are seeing some of this going on in Latin America, in Bolivia, and places like that. I mean, and it began with the water wars and things like that, and people started to see something different and some certain different possibilities. And I think this, by the way, is one of the reasons why Hart and Negri have got out of this business. You don't take state power, because they've been talking a lot to the folk in Bolivia, and if they go down there and kind of say, don't take state power, and people kind of look at them as they're mad. So you begin to see these things moving, and when a group gets together and starts to kind of create a social movement, it starts to create the vision, and then the vision itself starts to animate more of the social movement. So again, we've got to get that dialectic in motion. I mean, what's distressing to me in this country right now, as far as I can see, most of the vision thing is about these crazy right-wingers running around doing the kind of sort of things they're doing, and pontificating in the way they do, with a certain kind of revolutionary discourse, actually. It's quite a revolutionary discourse in its own way. And we are not in a position, as it were, to actually create something like that on the left. We're not doing that very well on the left right now. So I think in this country, it's probably going to take a little while for this legitimation crisis to build to a certain point where we're not going to be waiting for Obama, I mean, it's not like, he can't do a lot of the things that I would want to see him do. He obviously can't. I mean, he's got Congress, which is dominated by what I call the party of Wall Street. And I think we should actually have a party of anti-Wall Street to begin with. That might be a good thing. And throw out all of those people who accept any money from Wall Street whatsoever. And if we could do that, what a different Congress we would have, and what different kinds of reforms we would have. But we've got to start thinking about these movements, and again in this sort of dialectical way. I agree with you entirely that there has to be a normative element, but the normative elements are not something that can be imposed from on high. Some philosopher, telling us what is an ethic or a moral position, or something like that. So I don't think the argument is a moral argument, but certainly there has to be lots of norms which are going to be built into the social movement, any social movement, and certain aspirations. But it's hard to do that in abstraction. And I'm very reluctant to try to do that in abstraction outside of some sense of who is going to do it where. Because what they're going to do, and they're likely to do very different things in different parts of the world, depending upon what their situation is and what their condition is. I mean, I am a geographer after all, and I know that things are different, actually, around the world. And that therefore what looks like something that's revolutionary here doesn't look revolutionary at all in Bolivia right now. In fact, last time I was in South America, I have to say, people looked at me like I was some real conservative kind of, where's your imagination, they'd say, and I'd go, yeah, all right, So these things, so we've got to think about again, the dialectic of this, and also think about the geography of it.
Quickly, the question about military recruitment. It's an interesting question because I believe India actually has the second largest armed forces in the world after China, which stands to reason given the relative populations. But again, compare that to the size of the population. I don't think the military recruitment is necessarily a response to to the kind of marginalization problems that we were talking about. Although it is true that one gets reports from time to time in the Indian press about recruitment stations being besieged by thousands of people who want to get into the army because it is in fact a fairly coveted career with a secure job. And of course the good thing is the Indian army doesn't have to go out to Iraq to fight. But on the question of the big question about whether the neoliberal state is at an end, I agree with David Harvey on this. I don't think it's at an end. In fact, what we are seeing today is people who were only yesterday neoliberals suddenly become Keynesians overnight. It's the same people. And very often it just looks like that there is a what would have been called the neoliberal orthodoxy, the Thatcherite orthodoxy, the Reagan orthodoxy 20 years ago, has actually managed to enlarge and incorporate a whole range of other policy alternatives which would have gone under different names. But if in fact some of the things that we're seeing, including the most recent crisis, is a certain feature of a cyclical movements within our late capitalist phase, then in fact these responses, I would argue, are part of the same context. That in fact, ideological labels are not necessarily going to stand in the way of adopting many of these kinds of techniques if they are deemed to be appropriate. The question of agency, or the political agency, is clearly a very big question, especially in the context of arguments about revolution. What is revolution? What are the possibilities of revolutionary politics here? And one of the things I would suggest is that there is clearly a lack of the great transition narratives that we did have earlier on in the 20th century. Many of those transition narratives have gone, especially given the experience of let's say, the Chinese Revolution, where looking back now, it just seems like the whole Maoist period was really an intermediate stage between the transition from feudalism to capitalism in China. So effectively, it's the Communist Party which carried out this massive task of primitive accumulation, which the Chinese bourgeoisie was meant to have done, but it's been accomplished by other forces. Now, if that is the case, then I would argue that even in places like Brazil or India, there is a major lack of the kind of transformative vision of revolutionary politics. It's not there. But on the other hand, I don't think this means that there is no political agency, even in the kinds of engagement with governmental policies. The fact that, for instance, I mentioned this, the most latest sort of major policy initiative in terms of a guaranteed employment to all poor people who need it. Now, one ought not to think of this as something that happened without the political agency of the people who actually put pressure through all sorts of means, and they continue to do it, so that, in fact, it becomes a recognized condition, political condition, for the ruling groups to say, yes, we have to do this. It is not because there was no political agency. Interesting question, of course, is where does this develop? I mean, David raises this very big question about the totality. Is there a vision of this totality that informs many of these kinds of political initiatives? And I think it's correct to say that there does not appear to be this very broad vision. The interesting thing about you raised this question of the Maoists, who, of course, do always claim that they have this broad vision, which is overthrow the government. I have my doubts about the military tactics that are being adopted. but then that is also a sign to a certain extent of the marginalization of, precisely the marginalization of these groups of people and their forms of politics. That in fact, this sort of total rejection of the entire systems appears to be possible. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Harvey, I guess. So, in my understanding, what's going on between the Western world and India and China right now, big problem is that it's a fight about distribution and that there's little space for emancipation within this fight. And my question to Professor Chatterjee would be whether these excluded people or excluded groups in India would be the revolutionary subject and that we would hope for, who cannot lose anything but their chains.
I mean, the distribution question is actually very interesting. We haven't talked at all about what some of us do talk about, which is the shift of hegemony. In some ways, that's going on from North America to East Asia. And you only got and this is a very interesting moment to look at that. I mean, we've been in zero growth in this country, although we had 3% last quarter, but China's been clipping along at 8 or 9%. It's got its growth model. India too, and most of East Asia has come out of this much faster than Europe or North America. And so actually there is a redistribution going on right now through the mechanics of the crisis. Very significant redistribution. Somebody jokingly kind of said, well, this whole thing has changed things so that, instead of China becoming dominant in 80 years, it's going to be dominant in 40 years or something like that. But actually I think things are moving rather faster. And so I think that, but actually what this pulls into sight is again one of the things which is likely to get in the way, very strongly in the way, of any kind of global emancipatory politics, which is in fact the likelihood that there's going to be a lot of interstate competition emerging over who's going to bear the cost of the crisis most, who's going to come out of it fastest, and all the rest of it. So that, and a lot of that is going to be powered by sort of nationalist leanings and the like. I mean, I've only been to China once, but what really struck me while I was there was the powerful sense of real strong sense of nationalism. And to some degree, in a peculiar kind of way in which, for instance, Chinese nationalism, Korean nationalism, Japanese nationalism are not getting on all well. There's a lot of potential conflict there, and of course also some potential conflict with India. Yet at the same time, economically, there's word that actually the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese are really coordinating their currencies in some way right now. So there are levels of economic cooperation going on, which then is another layer of nationalism, which is not about cooperation at all. So I agree with you entirely that actually the way in which this question over who is going to do it where is likely to be very, 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 very made much more complicated by the fact that there are significant redistributions going on in wealth and power, and indeed in terms of where the capitalist class is going to be most significantly located. It's not necessarily going to be in North America. And to some degree, although North America is still extremely powerful, so there's that interstate competition. And I think many of the kind of versions of the kinds of solidarities that are going to be created in order to get out of the crisis are not necessarily going to be kind of a global emancipatory movements of solidarity at all. They could be sort of much more imprisoned in terms of national identity nationalism, the drive to try to preserve wealth, as in this country, or the drive to accumulate more wealth, as is the case in East Asia. So I think that there are a whole set of issues there which you correctly raised, and which then gets exacerbated by certain mental conceptions of the world which actually see the rest of the world in geopolitical terms. And in fact, there are many people in this country who are reigniting geopolitical theory in ways which I frankly find rather scary. I mean, these are the kinds of things, of theoretical apparatuses that were around in the 1920s and 1930s, and we can see what damage they did. But there are many people, and this includes Huntington's clash of civilizations, as well as the more geopolitical kind of theories that are being associated with somebody like Robert Kaplan, who writes these things called The Revenge of Geography. Now, I'm a geographer, and I don't want geography to be vengeful. You know? I mean, it's kind of really odd. I mean, you find all these people like, Jared Diamond reinvents environmental determinism, which as a geographer I detest. And Robert Kaplan's reviving geopolitics, which is a kind of geography I detest. So here I am as a geographer detesting most of the public geographies which are now being presented. And again, there's a battle over conceptions that has to be waged, which is a very serious battle, and that's where I lie, but, it's very difficult to stop many of these people who think they know what geography is about, actually pontificating in this way, which is against, it seems to me, what I would want to be involved in, which is a much more global emancipatory project.
I don't see the vision, the emancipatory vision, as described in the kinds of transition narratives to the next stage of social structures and forms of production and so on and so forth. I don't see those narratives in the kinds of political actions that are now taking place among the excluded people in India. On the other hand, there may well be revolutionary subjects carrying out forms of revolution that we still don't know and can't describe, which may well be forms of revolutionary transformation in the future, and that's what I would want to hope for. So, thank you.
I think we'll thank our organizers, Lopa Ashok, very much.